Hello, everyone. So last Saturday, during our weekly practice, a student asked a question about spleen deficiency. So I didn't really understand the term, I never heard of it. I know what spleen is, both in the Western context as well as the Eastern context. So at first I thought it was referring to a something that from the medical science, from the Western medical science. So my quick response was that, well, let me first understand that before I answer the question. And I said, by the way, the Western concept of the splint is very, very different from the Eastern concept of the splint. And that's kind of how I left it. And I said, well, let me study that, and I'll put together an answer, because the question is a very important one, and it's something that I like to address. As soon as I finished the class, I looked up the word spleen deficiency. Well, it turns out that it was actually a translation of a Chinese term. It was actually referring to something very specific in the traditional Chinese medicine. And the original language was pi xu. Pi means splint, and xu means void or empty. So it actually has a deeper meaning than deficiency. It means that a solid organ like the splint is deprived of its essence. That's what it means. So I like to take this opportunity to go a little deeper about what it means to be void of essence. Okay, so before I do that, I think it's important that we go back to the origin of the Western science and see how that differs from the Eastern science, particularly the medical science. Now, the beginning of the Western science basically started with Galileo, right? There were scientists before him, but interestingly, they didn't want to defy the church. So most of the work that were published before Galileo were published after the death of the authors. Galileo was really the first one that published his work while he was still alive. And what he was interested was understanding the tie and understanding the relationship between the tie and the planets. So he invented his telescope, and he started to observe the biggest planet that we can see with our naked eye, which is Jupiter. And he essentially deduced that it was the Jupiter and the moon and the sun together that affects the tie. But he went beyond that. He actually decided that it wasn't the sun that was circulating around the Earth, but rather it was the Earth that was circling around the sun, as well as the Jupiter that was circling around the sun. And that, of course, according to the interpretation at the time, was against the teaching of God, because, as you know from the book of Genesis, God created light. Then he parted the water to reveal the earth. And then later on, he created the sun and the moon and the difference between day and night. So obviously, it was the earth that was the center of the universe, and everything evolved around that. And so he was declared as a heretic, and essentially was house arrest and die in his own home. Now, of course, Newton came along and actually invented calculus and invented Newton's laws and was able to explain planetary motion. But the point is that it wasn't until the 1600s that the Westerner discovered Jupiter and the other planets and how they relate to the Earth and the Sun. Now, interestingly, the Chinese has discovered that 4,000 years ago, not 400 years ago. And the reason that why the Chinese were so much more interested in the universe than the Westerners is that the Chinese believed, or the Chinese emperor believed, that they were the son of God. And so knowing the universe allows them to really secure their positions in the hierarchy of the society. And so they had a long history of employing astronomers and astrologists. And so for many, many thousands of years, the Chinese understood that with their naked eyes, they could see not only Jupiter, but Mars and Saturn and Venus and Mercury and so forth. And they discovered long ago that it took 12 years for the Jupiter to return to its original position. And that's the beginning of the 12th zodiac. And so, for example, I was born in the year of the monkey, and every 12 years, the year of the monkey came along. But it also discovered that that was not enough. That was really not enough to explain what they wanted to explain, because there were other planets. And in fact, they focused on the other 4 planets, total of 5. And they noticed that it actually took 60 years for all the planets to return to the original positions. And so that's the beginning of what we have, the 60 protective deities. Now, what's interesting is that this idea of the 5 planets, and then ultimately what we call the 5 elements. Now, the Chinese word, it doesn't really translate into element, because it's not the word meant agents of change, or word meant motion. And so it's not element as in the Western concept of a elemental tables, something that is fixed, but it's more like agents of change. And so they, from the idea of the 5 planets, they discovered to identify these 5 agents of change, which are the water, the metal or the mineral, the fire, the wood or the vegetation, and the earth, or more precisely the soil. And what's interesting is that they decided that in order for life form to appear, in order to sustain a life form, we must have all these 5 elements, quote unquote. And actually, this is very scientific. This is actually very scientific. So we always understood that, for example, water is the source of life. Without water, there will be no life, right? It's because today the scientists are interested in looking for planets that could have life form. The first thing they look for is water. So water is a source of life. And the first appearance of life is some simple form of vegetation, algae or something. So as soon as you have water, then vegetation would appear. Now, as soon as vegetation appears, it starts to change the atmosphere, right? Because it consumes carbon dioxide. And now the sun starts to appear, and that's the fire element. And then with the sun, the earth or the soil start to warm up. And the earth is actually the cradle of life. So this is the kind of opposite of water. Water is a source of life. Without water, there is no life. Without soil, there can be, the life cannot sustain itself. But the soil requires both the seed of vegetations and the warmth from the sun. Ultimately, vegetation starts to grow on the soil, and it decomposes and becomes mineral. And mineral is added back into water, and now water have vitality. And then a more refined form of vegetation will appear and so forth. So you have this positive cycle, positive feedback. But they also decided that, so what we call the generating interaction or reinforcement. But the Chinese also believe that if that's all you have, you cannot have harmony, because you might have too much fire, you might have too much water. So they also decided that in addition to this yang interaction, this positive reinforcement, there has to be a negative, a more of a restraining action. For example, water restrains fire. right? You can put out fire. Fire restrains metal because you can melt metal. On the other hand, metal restrains wood. Simplest thing is that you can make an axe out of metal and then chop wood, right? Crack wood. Wood restrained earth, right? Because you have a landslide. The trees would grow roots and prevent a landslide. And then lastly, the earth can then restrain water. You can imagine having a dam, or the water would flow between mountains, right? And so this is really what it means by yin and yang, is that there is a reinforcement called the yang, and then there is a restraining called the yin. And it's the 5 elements together that creates the harmony. And in the simplest form is that it creates harmony on the planet that can sustain life, whereas the other planets cannot sustain life. And before I move, one interesting thing is that the moon is missing in this diagram, right? Which is interesting because the moon is the planetary object that's closest to the Earth, but yet it's not in this diagram. That was never explained. However, if you think about it from a modern science standpoint, all of these planets have a molten core. So as they rotate, the metal core rotates, right, which creates electricities, and then it creates magnetism. So actually, the effect of the planets on each other is magnetic. Whereas the moon has a solid core, so it has gravitational effect on the Earth, but it does not have magnetic effect on the Earth. And this is something that we need to keep in mind as we talk about qi, because you can't talk about qi without talking about the other part. So in Chinese, we don't use a single word like qi. Instead, in this case, we use 2 words called shi, qi. Shi means blood, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And shi is, you can imagine shi is like the flowing of the iron particles in the blood. So that's the electricities. And as it flows, energy is created, and that's actually magnetic. So this is kind of an interesting observation here. The other thing that is interesting is that the planets have an effect on us in the absence of the sun, right? Because during the day, the effect on us is dominated by the sun. It's only when the sun is set that the effect of the planets would appear. And so again, when we talk about the 5 elements or the 5 agents of change, you need to keep that in mind, that we're really talking about the yin, not the yang. Okay. Now, all that is very abstract, and it remained abstract for a long time until Bodhidharma came in the early 5th or 6th century. And he was a yogi from India, and he brought with him the traditional yoga practice. And he was also considered the 28th disciple of the original historical Buddha. So Bodhidharma is considered the first patriarch of Zen meditation in China. And so he brought with him a lot of what we now consider modern meditation practice. Of course, he eventually went to Japan, but that's many thousands, well, at least 1,000 years later. But so what Bodhidharma did was that he brought with him the meditation, the deep meditation technique, right? And the Chinese learned that from him. And there was a very important change in the Taoist practice. You do know that the Buddhists and the Taoists they coexist in China. The Buddhist is a foreign practice, whereas the Taoist is a traditional practice. But up until the appearance of Bodhidharma, the Taoists were really alchemists. And so we talk about Dan Tian, the field of Dan, or nine dan, which is internal dan. Dan until Buddha, dan meant red. It's the color of the pill. It's the result of alchemy. And so until Bodhidharma came along, it was really, they were really swallowing mineral that they refined as an idea of longevity, right? But when Bodhidharma came, then the whole idea of this external alchemy became internal alchemy. And they now talk about the qi that is inside of them. And there's a very famous person, Lu, who was born a few hundred years after Bodhidharma. He's known as one of the 8 immortals. If you understand the Chinese culture, he's one of the important ones. And he is the one that actually practiced both Taoism and Buddhism. And there are some basis because when they discover diagrams called the internal practice, and what we often practice in our session on Saturday called the microcosmic orbit, where it's really exercising the qi from along the spiral cord up to the top of the head, down in the front. And so we talk about the qi, the yin and the yang and all that. That really came about after Bodhidharma. And once they understood how to meditate and enter deep meditative states, they discovered that there are energy lines that are traveling within the body. And particularly they identified 6 energy loops. And today we call them the secondary meridians. And 3 of them travel from inside the body to the fingers, which are the extremities, and 3 of them travel from the inside the body to the toes, which are another set of extremities. And of course, you have the primary, which travel to the most important extremity of all, which is the top of the head. But at least these 6 energy loops can be divided into 12 meridians. Each of the loop has a yang and a yin. The yang are the energy traveling out to the extremities, and the yin are the one that travel back. And then they start to identify them with the 5 elements. And they discover that each of the energy loop are active for 4 hours in a day. So that makes up the 24 hours. So we'll come back to this in a minute. And they start to identify these energy loops with organs, right? But still in a very abstract level, because you realize that the Western science, Western medical science is based on dissecting cadavers, dead bodies, study of the dead bodies. So their organs are not abstract. Whereas the Chinese, the culture does not allow the opening of a dead body. Even those who were murderers, and the punishment is decapitation. It is within the culture that we have to return the whole body to the family. We cannot open them up like that. So opening up a dead body has never been part of the Chinese culture, other than the extreme case when you're doing forensics. And so for the longest time, we talk about internal organs, but they were in a very abstract level. It was only about 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, when the Westerners start to come into China, that we start to bring the two together. And so it's very unfortunate that when we talk about the splint, we think about this one organ that you can easily remove and just not a problem. Whereas the Eastern concept of splint is something very, very important. And before I go on and talk about spleen deficiency, it's important to spend a little bit of time on this diagram. And again, here we identify 6 energy loops. Each of the loops consists of energy flowing from the inside of the body to the extremities and then coming back. So this is the yang and the yin. We associate these energy lines with the 5 organs, But we also associate them with the emotions and the seasons. Okay, so for example, in Chinese there are 5 seasons, not 4. The summer is actually divided into 2. There's the half of it that are closer to spring, and then the half of it closer to the winter. And so let me come back to the organs in a minute, and then I'll talk about the clock, the biological clock. So the organs, as I explained, are divided in a very abstract way, divided into what's called the solid organs versus the empty organs. That's the typical translations. I actually prefer to translate from the Chinese writing. So when we say solid, it's actually treasure organs. When we say empty, they're actually vessel organs. Now the difference here is that the treasure organs are the one that contains the essence, which is why it's called solid. These are the yin organ, okay? And so we identify 5 of them, and the kidney, the liver, the heart, the spleen, and the lung. The kidney is the water, the liver is the vegetation or the wood, the heart is the fire, the spleen is the earth or the soil, and the lung is the metal or the mineral. Now, the reason why we think of them as treasure organs and as we think of them as yin organ, yin in this case means feminine, is that these are the organs that contain the essence that you were born with. So they're prenatal. And they are actually the organs that need to be developed first before the fetus is vital. Now, we talk about the 12 secondary vessels, secondary meridians. At the same time, we talk about the 2 primary. There are actually 8 primary, but usually we only talk about 2, which is one goes from, we talk about the top of the head, which is where all the yang energy comes together. But this is what we call the governing. It starts at right here, travel, and then it goes all the way back to the very bottom of the torso, and then it continues up through the tip of the tongue, and then that's why when we meditate, we the tip of the tongue is at the roof of the mouth to make the complete electrical circuit. Now, starting at the tip of the tongue all the way down to the bottom of the torso is actually the yin of the primary, and the tongue is actually a very important part of all the internal organs. But in any case, this is called the yin. All right. So the energy that is developed in the yin started with the fetus, and I talked about this in the past that often when a woman is pregnant, they have a shadow, a line in front. And the Chinese believe that that's a reflection of the energy line in the fetus. And so the kidney and the liver and the heart and spleen and the lung are the one that get first developed, because they need to have that in order to be vital. Why that is being developed, the yang in the yang energy in the back, which corresponds to the bladder, the gallbladder, the intestines, and the stomach, we call those vessel organs or empty organs. They're the one that contains essence of the essence that the universe provided to you, not the essence that are provided by your mother. And those get developed later because the baby doesn't need bladder, they don't need intestines, they don't need stomach, right? And so that's how we separate the yin and the yang organs. So, for example, when we say the kidney represents water, well, the bladder is also water. So the kidney is the yin part of the water, and the bladder is the yang part of the water, together like that. Okay. So now the next diagram is, I'll come back to the clock. And so just briefly, I live by this clock. And so my day actually starts when the large intestines is active, and that's in the morning from 5 to 7. I actually wake up at 6. So once I wake up, then I have this habit. I developed this habit long before I studied Qi and become a meditator. And this is only because I was an entrepreneur and I got to get my shit ready quote unquote. And so I have a habit of going to the bathroom and have my bowel movement. And that actually turns out to be a very important part. And now most people don't do that. Most people don't do that. But this is actually a very important part, is that you wake up when the large intestine's energy line is active, and you clear out all your waste. So I do that. Then you have your breakfast, and because that's when the stomach energy line is active. Now, the stomach energy line is active because you started to have digestion, but also the stomach is a yang energy line. And this is the time when you really want to be walking around, connecting between the earth and the heaven, and be part of the universe, and start to really be part of the yang energy that is provided by the sun. And so this is when I have my breakfast, and every day we started our practice at 7:30 a.m., Saturday in English, and Monday to Thursday in Cantonese. So we do this 5 days a week. On Saturday, on Friday, like today, we do this in the evening, just because it's that one day where the students in Asia will do it in the morning. And then on Sunday, I have other activities with the temple and in the past with the prison work and so forth. So I usually reserve my Sunday for that. And so I wake up at 6:30. I started my day around 7 o'clock, breakfast, exercise. Then at noontime is when the heart is active. Now, the Chinese, this is one thing that I didn't talk about, because we have 5 organs, but we have 6 energy lines. So the heart is actually split into 2, because the Chinese actually believe that there is the emotional heart and there is a physical heart. And so here we're talking about the emotional heart. And so when the heart is active, that's when you really want to rest, because that's also when the yang energy is very, very strong. And so this is a time when you eat your lunch, you nap, take a short nap, or you meditate, right? The siesta, huh? Okay. And then that's my day, right? That's midday, and then I continue with the second part of my day. And then around 9 o'clock or so, I start to wind down. There's an energy line called a triple warmer, which I won't explain here. But it's really the one that combines everything. And that's the time to relax, to take a shower, to massage. I usually just massage the bottom of my feet. And then just chill. And if you want, meditate. I usually don't do a sit meditation. In the past, I've done walking meditation around this time. But very often, I would actually start to sleep. And I would meditate while I'm lying down. But definitely by 11 o'clock, you want to be sleeping and hopefully entering deep sleep, because 11 o'clock is when the gallbladder and the liver are active. And that's the time when you really want to be lying down and resting and let your body rejuvenate itself. Okay? Now, the reason I wanted to bring that up is ultimately I'm going to talk about how to deal with spleen deficiency, and there's no simple answer. That's the punchline. It really has to do with how you live harmoniously, and harmoniously within yourself, harmoniously with the universe, both in terms of abiding by the celestial clock, right? Because after all, we live in a solar system. You better so the sun has a lot of effect on us, right? So you want to be living, within that solar cycle. But also you want it to be in harmony with universe by the way you eat, okay? Think about all the chemical you digest and so ingest, right? Anyway, so now let's get back to the spleen deficiency, which is really the question that was asked is the student says, well, I have that, what do I do about it? Now it's time to really understand the difference between splint in the Eastern concept versus splint in the Western concept. Splint in the Western concept is just one single organ. And the Western concept is really about the constellation of organs and how each one of them has its own functions. And if you have a deficiency, then just point to the organ and we'll fix it, right? The Chinese think very differently from that. It's never about a single organ. It's always about how everything works together as a system. So to really understand splint in the Eastern concept, you understand that splint is what we call the cradle of life, whereas the water, the kidney, is what we call the source of life, the beginning of life, right? It's so one is prenatal and one is postnatal. Splint is what you were born with, all the essence that you were born with, and I mean the kidney is all the essence that you were born with, whereas the splint is all the essence that you can cultivate. So this is why we call it's the cradle of life. To understand the splint, the concept of the splint, you really have to understand it in terms of the earth element. So think about gardening, right? Forget the organs in a minute. Forget your body in a minute. So just think about gardening. So when you garden, a lot of work is put into soil, the quality of the soil. So what does the soil do? Well, the soil is the one that stabilizes the temperature, right? Because during the day it's very hot and during the night it's very cold. So it can be very extreme, and your plant, your vegetation needs more stability than that. So one of the important parts of soil is that it stabilizes the temperature. In other words, it stabilizes the fire element. The soil element actually stabilizes the fire element. What is the other thing that it does? Well, it's where you have the organic fertilizers, the minerals, the nitrogens, and so forth. And so it's a place where you decompose and it incubates minerals that are important for the plants. So the soil element actually interacts with the metal element, right? The mineral elements. We understand that. Finally, it's the place where life actually can sustain, right? That's you have water, you have the vegetation. Now the vegetation needs to grow. So this is the cultivating. That's what planting is all about, cultivating vegetation. So it cultivates the wood element. And then finally, it regulates moisture, right? Regulate moisture. You can't, if you have no soil, then you have to figure out how to regulate the moisture differently. But with soil, that's what it does. That's what it does, right? That's why you want irrigations, you want rain and all that. And so in that sense, the splint is never a standalone organ. It is actually the one that works with all the other organs. It works with the heart, the lung, the liver, and the kidney. So what does it mean then when your splint is deficient? What does it mean? What happens? How do you know? Well, so this is the characters that people use to explain the function of the splint. The splint and the stomach actually work together. The splint has a very important function. It is the one, and the first character right here is a very, again, the Chinese characters, you cannot have meaning. Single word doesn't have meaning. It's really how you conjugate it with something else. So if you take this word, it means action, it means exercise, it means, even when we talk about planetary motion, something that goes around. So this is really something that is action. Now this next one, it can mean digestions, it can mean breaking down something. The next one means water. Now in this sense, it's not just water, it's really nutrient. And finally the last one means a valley, right? Something, but it can also mean silo, like the grain silo. So the idea here is that the splint has a very important function, which is there to help the stomach. The stomach is the silo where you consume food, but the food goes in the silo, mixed in with the enzyme, and the splint is the one that extracts the nutrient and then distribute it to the other organs. And then the stuff that cannot be extracted easily, then it then helps the stomach to push that down into the intestines for further processing. So you can imagine that if you have a deficient splint, how much it would affect your digestions. And so the four sort of functions of the splint in that sense is digestions, absorption, distributions, and transformation. So if you have a spleen deficiency, that's the first thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have a not only a digestion problem, but really an absorption problem. And not just absorption problem, but it's really the motion, the action that distribute the nutrients throughout your body and how you transform those nutrients into energy. It's a very, very, very bad thing to have spleen deficiency, because after all, the spleen is the cradle of life. And so imagine what happened to life when the cradle doesn't sustain life, right? So let's say you have that and you already experience these problems. It gets worse. The next one is called qi deficiency. That's now qi. There are different kinds of qi. So the spleen can cause qi deficiency. The lung can cause anyway. But in any case, here we're talking about how the spleen causes qi deficiency. That's when you all of a sudden you feel you just have no strength whatsoever. You get tired easily. You can't walk. You can't go up and down the stairs. You have no stamina. You have what's called brain fog, because the qi just doesn't travel in your body. You have right. And you have no nutrients that gets in your brain. Very bad, very bad. Then you have something called the blood deficiency. Remember I talked about qi is not a standalone word, that you actually need. We talk about the 血 qi. So this word here is called qi, and this one is called 血, which means blood. And now you have something called blood deficiency. And you can tell when the person has that because they have no color. They're pale. They're completely pale. Or even worse, they're yellow, like they just have no life in them. Their face shows it, their eyes shows it, right? The lip, the fingers. Now for women, that's even worse. It affects their menstrual cycle, and then eventually when they go into menopause, that's a problem too. This is a big problem. And then you have something else called it's deficient in the yang energy. Right, as opposed to the yin energy. So that's when the person just, his feet are cold, his hands are cold, his ears are cold. He doesn't feel comfortable when there's air conditioning in the room. He doesn't feel comfortable when he's outside, the wind blowing at them. He's particularly sensitive to cold drinks. It causes blowing at the stomach. Cold drinks and cold food, very bad. But that's not the worst. That's not even the worst. Because the spleen has other functions as well. The spleen energy line is also part of the pancreas, right? And it's also part of the entire system that returns water back into the heart, right? And so then you have something called, and if I try to translate, it means stranded by wetness. Stranded by wetness. It really comes down to something called viscosity, that all your body fluids become very viscous, and affects your lungs, so you have a lot of phlegms. It affects it is also the base. It's also the beginning of type 2 diabetes, which is really insulin resistance. And when you have that problem, you start to have too much glucose in your blood, and it can cause dementia, as in the case of my father. It can even cause cancer, because essentially the cells in your body can no longer survive. You're not, the environment, the cradle of life is no longer hospitable to yourself, and now the cells become cancerous. It's very bad. Okay, how do you overcome that? If you're looking for a simple answer, you can stop now. Well, from the Chinese perspective, it's all about qi. It's all about blockage of qi. It's not one organ. It's really the system. And so we have different modalities: acupuncture, herbal medicines. We do the exercise that we do, qigong exercise. Which comes different forms of that. So our Saturday practice, you can tell that we start with joint exercise, stretching, breathing, tapping of the energy points. And then at the end of class, we either do the 5 breathing exercise, or we do the I Ching Ching, which is really Qigong. And so we do all that, and I do practically all that, right? Because I see my herbal doctor once a month, and I have my acupuncture. I do get medicine that for health maintenance, and then as you can tell, I do a lot of qi therapy, what I call qi therapy. So you have a lot to choose from, but ultimately they all do the following. One is direct. You have problem with the splint, let's address the splint. But it's not just the splint, it's the splint in the stomach. So it is all about the splint in the stomach, working on the earth element, digestions, eat properly, right amount, right time, right kind of food. I'm not a doctor, so I can't tell you what that means precisely, but I do know a thing or two. Stay away from cold drinks. Stay away from, because spleen deficiency ultimately lead to yang deficiency, and so you want to maintain the yang in your body. So cold drink, very cold drinks, stuff that you just take out from the refrigerator. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have ice cream, just don't have so much of it, right? Now, so that's understood. And then I'll talk about some of the energy points that are associated with the splint in the stomach, and we'll work on that. But that's not enough. There's an indirect method, and it's actually divided into 2. So if you go to the splint, this is the earth element. You notice that there are 2 arrows pointing to it. So these are the enforcements, both in the yang and the yin kind of way. It's the heart reinforcing the splint and the liver reinforcing the splint. And so blood circulation, making sure that you exercise, right? And making sure that you that would help your splint. Having a clean liver, cut back on your alcohol. I'm not saying that you shouldn't drink alcohol. I take a half a glass of red wine every day. It's my therapy as well, because it helps me to relax. But how your alcohol can affect your liver, everybody knows that. What's less known is how sugar affects the liver, and how carbohydrate affects the liver. So you need to study up on that. Now, by doing that, then you would have a healthy heart and a healthy liver. Those reinforce the splint. Then there's the indirect way, because there are 2 arrows that are pointing away from the splint. One points to the lung and one points to the kidney. So if you learn how to breathe with your diaphragm, so you increase your lung capacity, so you can have more oxygens in your body. You don't smoke anything. Then you have a healthy lung. Is putting less of a load on your splint. And finally is the kidney. Right? Now there's so much it can do to affect the kidney in a negative way, because the kidney is the source of life. It contains the essence of life. Now this is something that most people don't want to talk about, because it's your lifestyle. It turns out that the Chinese believe that too much sexual activity depletes your kidney. Because what we talk about, the water element here, is not just the water. It's also the blood. And so when we say the essence of the kidney, the essence of life, it's the ingredients that makes up the marrow. So the marrow is grown in your bones and ultimately goes into your brain. We believe that the brain matter is an extension of the bone marrow. But it also affects something else. It's also the system that governs your reproductive systems. So in any case, that's just how we see it. So sexual activities depletes your kidney. I know you don't want to hear about that, but all right. So come back to our Qi therapy and how we actually address Qi, address spleen deficiency, both directly, indirectly. So these are all in Chinese, of course. So this is the energy line for the splint, which starts at the big toe. You remember we talked about that. So there's at least 2 energy points that we work on. There's energy points that are immediately, the first one on your arch, remember? And we come up. Now this Chinese word Gongshan actually means princelings. So we always know about the Emperor Qin, the first emperor that unites China. Well, before him, China was not united as much as that it was governed by a royalty class who were all the princelings of the Chao emperor. And so the reason it's named that is because the Chinese believe that this one energy point governs the entire body, right? That's why they named them after that. And then so we work on that. So you pay attention. That's the first thing that we work on after we work on the gushing spring. Then there's another energy point, which is we measure 4 fingers from the angle on the inside of the leg. I call that the 3 yin meet. This is an important energy point. It is actually the place where the splint, the kidney, and the liver comes together. So we work on that. Now we do work on the stomach. The stomach has an important energy point in the front of the leg. Now keep in mind that the splint is a yin energy line, so it's in the inside of the body, away from the sun. Whereas the stomach is the yang energy line, so it's in the front of the leg, exposed to the sun. So we have this one energy point that is 4 fingers below the kneecap, and we'll work on that, right? And so that's a very, very good point. And together is the direct method of improving the splint, right? Then we do a lot with the kidney. The kidney starts with the gushing spring, then it comes up. I call this the warming of the valley. Then it comes behind the angle. I call that the supreme river, and then it comes up and joins up with the 3 yin mid. And so we do that. Well, the kidney is the yin, again, is in the inside, whereas the bladder is the yang that travels in the back. We do a lot with the bladder. Back of the calf, a very important point, is actually the on-off switch for the gushing spring. Very good for reducing your chance of having dementia, my experience. And then it goes up to the back when we do the vertical windmill, water and fire, mixing water and fire. It's all about the bladder energy line. We do a lot with the gallbladder. The gallbladder is the yang for the liver. We do a lot. It's on the side. It actually helps with the blood flow. And for example, we're on the side, 2 energy points above the knee, 3 energy points below the knee on the outside of the leg. Then we have the shoulder, called the well of the shoulder, and then right behind the on the neck, that we call the pond of the wind. Very important. It helps with the liver. And then we have the lung, right? The lung, we call this the right in front, right? We call it the gate to the cloud. And then it comes in at the elbow, and then it continues with to the big toe. There's an energy point here that we do very last, called the cracking spoon, right? Remember that? Right here, we crack the bone. Anyway, there's, of course, that's only 6 out of 12. There's another 6, but I think you get the point that we actually cover everything. Okay, so final conclusion. It's not as simple as you think. Spleen deficiency doesn't mean deficient of the splint, right? It's in fact a lifestyle disorder. I know you don't want to hear that. It's the way you live your life. There's something wrong. So I'm sorry there's no simple answer, because the only way to fix that is to go back to how you eat, how you drink, how you work, how you sleep, How you go to the bathroom. The bowel has a lot to do with this. How you exercise. What kind of therapy do you do? If you just do foot massage or you do acupuncture, that's fine. And how you meditate, how you maintain the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerve. It's not that simple. It's not simple, right? And the universe is not that simple. And we're part of the universe. So why would you expect that our health is simple? Life exists because there's a harmony between the elements. And our health exists because there's a harmony in our elements. So it's all about harmony. Okay? I hope this helps. Bye-bye. See you on Saturday.